In the mid-1990s, corporate Canada adopted a new set of guidelines to inform the structure of their boards of directors. That happened because many felt companies hadn't responded adequately to the crises they'd faced up to that point. A quarter century on, and amid mounting emergencies such as COVID-19, climate change, inequality, racism, and ongoing gender gaps, is another overhaul needed. Let's explore that with, in Boston, Massachusetts, Veena Ramani. She is Senior Program Director, Capital Market Systems at Ceres. And there's Sarah Kaplan. She's Director at the Institute for Gender and the Economy and a professor at the U of T's Rotman School of Management. Her most recent book is The 360-Degree Corporation: From Stakeholder Trade-Offs to Transformation. And it's good to have both of you on the agenda tonight. Sarah, by way of background, you wrote this report called Where Are the Directors in a World in Crisis? Let's just start, let's set the table for our discussion to come with that. Why did you write the report in the first place?
Well, as you mentioned in the introduction, there's been guidelines that were launched a number of years ago, and time has passed and the world has changed. And we are now at a moment, as the title of the report says, where the world is in crisis for the reasons you mentioned, existential crisis because of climate change and other things. And so I got together with Peter Day, who was the original writer of governance guidelines in 1994, and suggested 25, now 26, 27 years later, we really needed to revisit those for a new set of realities. And I think it's also because of COVID, there's been some increased awareness of the important role that the corporation can play in society and must play in society.
But the inference I draw from that title is that wherever they are, you think they're not doing what they ought to be doing. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think so, in the sense that I think that Canada has come up to speed on the governance standards of the 20th century, but really now we have 21st century challenges, and there are a number of things that members of boards of directors really need to be aware of, take on board, address, and deal with, that involve all the stakeholders that surround them. And there are some good examples of boards that are doing this, but many, many in Canada are not yet up to speed.
We will get into that. Veena, you were on the advisory panel, I gather, for this report. What role did you play?
I work for an organization called Ceres, Steve, here in the US. And Ceres works with large companies and large investors on large sustainability issues like climate change. And one of the reasons that we focus on the role of the board is because at the end of the day, we want companies to take robust and ambitious action that addresses these, as Sarah put it, existential crises for the business and financial risks they are. And corporate boards, with their role at the top of the organizational structure and their ability to really hire, fire, and incentivize management, we think play an extraordinarily important role in making sure that companies adopt their business strategies to make them resilient in the face of these environmental and social challenges.
I don't know if it's possible to say, generally speaking, are they playing that robust role that you want them to play? But can you sort of comment on whether, generally speaking, they are?
I mean, I'm going to say, generally speaking, we're not quite sure because there isn't a significant line of sight into what boards do and what they don't. But here's what the data does show us, right? So last year, PwC did a survey of US corporate directors and found that just 38% of them recognize that environmental and social issues pose financial risk. They are starting to recognize that investors want them to play an increasingly assertive role in issues like climate change. So I take some small comfort from that. But here's another really depressing data point. Just earlier this year, there was a study that came out of NYU, the Stern School of Business, that looked at the backgrounds of the corporate directors on the boards of the Fortune 100, some of the largest companies in the world, and found that less than 5% had demonstrable fluency in material, environmental, and social issues to their business, right? So if you take those two data points together, you take the fact that most corporate directors still don't understand the financial and business relevance of environmental and social crises to their business. And also they just don't have the fluency to be able to engage on these issues in a robust, informed, and thoughtful manner. And that leads to a state of affairs that I have to say depresses me a little bit.
Okay, in which case, Sarah, let's really go back to first principles here. We're going to go like Rotman 101 in terms of business class right now. Boards of directors, what in fact is their mission with a company?
Well, the boards of directors have a legal responsibility to represent the shareholders in the governance of the corporation. They hire and fire the CEO. They set the compensation and executive packages for not just the CEO, but the executive leadership. And they also offer guidance and make final decisions on very important things that the company does that have to do with risks, that have to do with acquisitions, that have to do with major strategic moves. And they are meant to be the oversight of the company to make sure that the company is executing on its duty, which is to the duty to the corporation. And so the board of directors, they don't run the company, but they provide a lot of oversight and final okay on key decisions that are going to have an impact on the company and the company's impact on the world.
But let me ask you about power, because boards of directors tend to be part-time people, whereas the CEO is a very full-time job. So who's really got the power in that relationship?
Well, this has been a subject of very long debate and a contention, and part of prior governance reforms, in fact, the ones that Peter Day had recommended, 25 years ago or more, was to split the role of the chair of the board from the CEO. And, there had been a long tradition where the person who chaired the board was the CEO, and that splitting up of the CEO and the chair of the board was meant to kind of right the balance between these two players and make sure that the board had its separate and independent oversight, that the board wasn't filled with executives who were simply rubber stamping what the executives wanted, but played an actual counterpart to the things that the executives do. And the other way that they have influence is, of course, they set the compensation package. So they are basically telling the CEO and the senior leadership, you're only going to make your bonus or you're only going to get your raise if you are actually executing on these goals that we have set for you.
Well, that leads to the next question, Veena, which is, how do you get to be on a board? How do you get chosen?
Well, board members are typically chosen because they know other people on boards. And that's a big part of the problem that we find ourselves with. Because as of now, corporate boards are populated by people who look a very particular way. They tend to be Caucasian, they tend to be older, they tend to be male. And when these existing corporate directors go to their networks to pick the new member on their board to recommend members for other boards, they tend to pick people who look like them. So you end up with a situation where of extraordinary homogeneity in corporate boards, which is why you are starting to see a strong focus by the investor community calling for more diversity on corporate boards, both in terms of getting more women on corporate boards as well as getting more people of color, a broader ethnic makeup. And that is supported by the research. There's research that shows that boards that are more diverse are actually oversee companies that outperform their peers on a range of financial metrics.
I would be most interested in your response to the not too long ago incident that took place when a major corporate leader in the United States said, look, I'd love to put more women on my board, but I couldn't find any qualified women to put on the board. What's your take on that?
Well, as you can imagine, my take is he isn't looking hard enough. Because the reality is that there are an extraordinary complement of extremely qualified women who sit on the management level of several large enterprises. But this is a part of the problem, right? If corporate boards, if CEOs are looking to a very specific skill set in populating corporate boards, it means that they're looking at a very narrow sample set in terms of the pool of directors that they could look to. But again, what investors are looking for corporate boards to do is be diverse, certainly in terms of gender and ethnicity, but also in terms of the kinds of backgrounds and skills that they could have represented on corporate boards, which is, again, a great way to certainly bring on and pull from the immense and talented pool of women, as well as people of different ethnicities who could play, I think, an extraordinary role on corporate boards.
Now, Sarah, if we've heard it once, we've heard it 1,000 times. The role of the board is to maximize shareholder value. Period. Full stop. Do you think that's right?
It's actually not right, and it's not even the legal responsibility in the Canadian context. The role of the board is to take care of the corporation, and can consider a full range of stakeholders, one of which are the shareholders, but that is not the only person or group of people that you care about. And this is in a little bit contrast between the US setup and the Canadian setup, because in Canada, certainly since the BCE Supreme Court decision in 2008, which actually said that the board did not only have a responsibility to the shareholders, and in fact did have a responsibility to consider other stakeholders. We have a legal framework in Canada that basically says the statement that you just made is incorrect. Yet we often hear this statement because, one, it's more predominant in the United States, and the United States kind of governance structure seems to have a shadow over what we consider in Canada. But in Canada, we actually don't have that legal framework. So to say that is actually incorrect from even a legal standpoint. And now when we consider all of the different kinds of risks that Veena is talking about, all of the different pressures on the company, even if that were the case, you would still have to pay attention to all of these other stakeholders if you were going to be exerting good governance.
Veena, maybe I can get you to follow up on that.
Yeah, and I was going to, so thank you, Steve. I will say that even in the US, the investor community is starting to recognize that any sort of company that doesn't pay attention to the interests and needs of its critical stakeholder groups isn't a company that's governing itself well. And this stands to reason, right? We see this right now with the coronavirus pandemic. Any company that isn't taking care of and investing in its workforce, and its employees, and its talent pool is a company that's not managing its core assets really well. So any sort of shareholder value, the primacy of the shareholder value approach that doesn't take into account the impacts of stakeholder groups on corporate performance is investors who aren't thinking in their own best interest.
Now, you used an expression there that, Sarah, again, we're going Rotman 101 here. We're going to bring it right down to brass tacks. Stakeholder groups. For a major corporation, what does that include?
Yes, and stakeholder is a word that sounds kind of jargony, and maybe people don't always understand exactly what it means. But what we're talking about is any group or people who are either impacted by or have an impact on the company. So that could include some internal stakeholders such as employees, but we're also talking about people who are concerned with the environment. We're talking about the general communities. We're talking about issues around inequality. We're talking about people in the supply chain. All of these issues are potentially related to how the company operates, how the company has an impact on society or people or groups that could have an impact on the company. Climate change is going to have a massive impact on every single company, either in terms of creating many, many risks, many disruptions. The increase in disruptions in operations caused by climate incidents is going up. These are the kinds of things that we're talking about when we talk about considering all of the different stakeholders.
Well, Veena, let me just for argument's sake, I'll play devil's advocate here. Let's take any corporate. Let's take McDonald's. Okay, McDonald's. Their stakeholders are their employees, their customers who eat their burgers. I mean, you could say that's it. Tell us why you think McDonald's ought to be equally as concerned with racial diversity, Black Lives Matter, climate change, gender parity, all of that kind of stuff.
Because these affect the company and the stakeholders that they work with. So, for instance, you talked about racial equality, and you talked about the McDonald's employees and McDonald's customers being the key stakeholder groups that they care about. Well, these constituencies, McDonald's employees, McDonald's customers, tend to be mixed from an ethnicity perspective. So clearly, an organization that isn't keeping what's the very important discussions that are happening in the US about systemic racism into account is not thinking about how these critical stakeholder groups are being affected by these issues and what that effect means in terms of their interaction with the companies in question. So companies don't operate in a vacuum, Steve. Companies operate within the context of the communities in which they are situated, within the context of the employees that they engage with on a day-to-day basis, and within the context of the customers who essentially provide them with a reason to exist. So to divorce the issues that affect these constituencies from the way that the company operates is just bad business practice.
Well, okay, Sarah, put us in the boardroom. And again, let's, just for argument's sake, let's take McDonald's. Let's say there's a McDonald's board of directors meeting, and they've got, a bunch of competing interests that they've got to resolve at a board of directors meeting. They got to make sure that their hamburgers taste great and are cheap. They got to make sure their customers are satisfied. They got to make sure their suppliers are they've got a good relationship with them. They've got to make, anyway, you know the list, it's all long. But now there is this other list of concerns as well that Veena has just expressed. Okay, how does the McDonald's board figure all of that out?
Well, that's, I think, the million or billion-dollar question that you've raised. These interests that we're talking about, and even with McDonald's, we could talk about climate change and the ways that, as one of the largest consumers of beef, and how the whole meat system is actually creating, major environmental damage and climate change. That, all of these issues have to be considered, and there is not an easy answer to that. What we are telling boards, and what I think is so important, is that boards need to recognize all of these issues, recognize how the movement towards Black Lives Matter matters for how they think about their employees, the advancement of their employees, the opportunities that they give, how environmental change is going to affect the disruption on their store operations or their impact on the environment. And they have to have all of those on the table. And then they have to have some kind of process they have to develop for themselves. And every company will have to do this in their own way, a process for thinking through and resolving these kinds of trade-offs that you highlight, because often there will be trade-offs. And what we have in the Canadian context is a duty to make sure that each of the stakeholders feels at least that they were treated fairly in that decision-making process, knowing that maybe not everyone can win in every single decision that is made. But we have something called the oppression remedy, which means that legally stakeholders can actually take a company to court with the leave of the court if they feel that they have not been fairly treated. And so the companies and boards have to develop some kind of process that will withstand that scrutiny.
Steve, can I jump in on this point as well?
Please.
Great. So I'm going to say that companies actually have really great systems in place to address risk, especially large companies, right? They have extraordinarily large, extraordinarily complex enterprise risk management systems. The problem that happens is the lack of recognition of environmental and social issues like climate change, as Sarah pointed out, issues like systemic inequality, systemic racism, workplace issues. The problem is they don't recognize that these issues are are business risks as well, and they don't run them through their enterprise risk management systems. And at the end of the day, data out is only as good as data in, right? Where companies are able to recognize the financial impacts of these issues, run the analytics, run the numbers, and then figure out what to do and what it means in terms of their business strategy. That's where the board becomes relevant. The board then takes this analytics, works with management to then help them make their decisions to make their business strategies resilient in the face of these risks. Companies know how to do this. They just need to first recognize that these environmental and social issues also pose financial impacts.
All right. Sarah, let's talk money. Because I suspect if we were having this conversation 50 or 75 years ago, and we were talking about how boards pay their executives, we would note that, executives in companies make 5, 10, 15 times the average salary of one of their employees. Today, it is exponentially off the charts more that they are compensated. Does anything need to be done about that?
Well, we're in a terrible do loop when it comes to executive compensation, where we have gotten to the point where, companies feel that they need to compete with each other for the top talent. And so we get this escalation of pay, and then different CEOs benchmark themselves against their peers and say, well, I need to make at least as much as that person. And in fact, the boards, in order to make sure that they're doing their fiduciary duty, often will hire a compensation consultant to help them with, developing CEO pay, but they very rarely then look at the advice from the compensation consultant and say, we're going to take the lowest pay at the bottom of the average of the peers. It's usually at the middle or higher. And what that means is we're getting this, there's a process now in terms of how boards determine CEO compensation and therefore executive compensation more broadly, that's leading to this escalation and to this massive disconnect between the pay of the CEO and the pay of the workers who are actually doing the work in the company. So we have a broken system, but there's not a very easy answer to figuring out how we fix the broken system because of the quote, war for talent for senior leadership.
Yeah, Veena, do you think it's really the case that an executive can be so important to the future success of a company that they need to make $50, $75, $100 million a year?
I think a part of the problem, Steve, is exactly the problem that Sarah articulated, that executive compensation systems are so complex, so extraordinarily detail-oriented that the board compensation committee usually doesn't deal with the details themselves. This is outsourced to a compensation consultant. And this is one of the few issues where boards can't or should not be relying on management. So I think you do end up in a situation where directors rely a lot on compensation consultants who are being paid by the company. And I think, you end up with a situation that Sarah, I think very articulately called a broken system where executives are paid extraordinary amounts.
Well, let's get to the overarching question here, which is if there are problems that you have described during the course of our conversation, and of course, Sarah, in your report, how do we want to solve them? And one option that some people say is governments need to get in there and legislate. They need to legislate quotas for boards. They need to legislate salary caps, for example, on executives. What's your view on whether that is an advisable thing to do?
Well, I would say that, legislation is one tool, and I think it can be important in certain places. However, we also know that the companies that, for example, are, traded on the TSX are very diverse. Some are quite small, some are much larger. And one of the reasons that Peter Day and I, in our report, 360 Governance, suggested that these are, well, of course, we're not legislators, so we can't tell companies to do these things, but we believe this guideline process might be better because of the very different situations that companies are in. So what I hope is that companies are going to adopt these things. But of course, even when we've had legislation, for example, or regulation, the Ontario Securities Commission has comply or explain for having companies report on the number of women on their boards. And over 5 years, we've seen very little progress and improvement. And only about a third of companies even set targets at all for achievement, whatever the target is. And so if companies don't adopt these things, then I think we need to move to more regulation. But I think we just have to be careful that regulation doesn't become something that, or legislation doesn't become something that just makes companies do things in a rote way, as opposed to using the information in the ways that Veena is describing to actually inform their business strategy.
Veena, how about you on that?
I think what we've seen in the US is a tremendous amount of action motivated by investor pressure. So, here's a really cool example. So Ceres, along with a number of groups, helps organize a process called the CA 100 Plus Initiative. It's the Climate Action 100 Plus Initiative, which brings together close to 500 global investors representing, $30-40 trillion in assets. And these are investors who are collectively engaging some of the most carbon-intensive companies in the world on their governance approach to climate change, including the approach taken by their board of directors. So we've seen, as a result of investor engagement, investor dialogue, a lot of companies start to set goals, start to, put systems at place at the board level to really systematize their oversight of issues like climate change, and also start to make linkages between executive compensation and climate change. So I think investor power, investor engagement can also get us a lot of the way we need to go.
Well, let's finish up on this, Sarah. If corporations do not see it as their own enlightened self-interest to be more inclusive in their appointments to boards of directors, do you think at the end of the day, governments need to get in there and legislate them to do it?
Well, yes. On a personal note, I'm a big fan of quotas. We've seen them work in other parts of the world, and people say, oh, we don't want quotas, or we might not even want targets because, that argument that we talked about before, where would we find the women or the people of color, people with disabilities, members of the LGBTQ community, indigenous people? They make this argument that there wouldn't be enough quality people. And we know from research on areas where quotas have been put in place that it actually increases the quality, it increases the effectiveness of boards because they have different lived experiences that allow them to consider these issues that we're talking about. So I'm not afraid of quotas at all. I can't tell companies to put quotas in place, but I think every company should be setting a target and reporting on that at least. And I personally believe that we may, if we don't see progress soon, we may need to move in the direction of quotas.
To be continued. Sarah Kaplan from the Rotman School of Management at U of T, Veena Ramani from Ceres in Boston. It's great to have both of you with us tonight on TVO. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.